Hi, welcome to Culture Shot. So I read a really interesting article this week about culture, about how strength of culture isn't always a great measurement. And it really pushed a button in my brain because this is a topic that I explored a couple of years ago as well, off the back of my research for my book, How to Build a Happy Sandpit. I interviewed leaders of business all over South Africa, all over the country, in a range of different fields and in a range of different businesses with different maturities and sizes. But one after another, those business leaders assured me that they had a very strong culture. And that seemed to be enough for many of them to kind of sit back and go, okay, we've got this now. But what began to dawn on me the more I got into the research is that strength is a fairly poor measurement, because strength doesn't mean good. A strong culture doesn't mean a good culture. Let me explain what I mean by this using a historical story. So when the Titanic hit the iceberg in 1912, it offered a real wake-up call to the shipping community and to the White Star Line that owned the Titanic in particular, that they'd been a bit fast and loose with some of the rules. They didn't have enough lifeboats. Whether they were inside regulations or not didn't matter. They weren't enough for the people on board. And there were a number of things that they could have done differently. And you think, therefore, that organization would have had a bit of a wake-up call. They might have actually gone, okay, we need to reassess here. You'd think that, but you'd be wrong, because actually what happened was the culture took over. And in the weeks that followed, some of the actions they took were evidence of an extremely strong culture. They were really consistent with the White Star Line's culture. But that's not a good thing. Some of the things that happened, the crew members who went down with the Titanic, who perished on the job, their families discovered that their salaries were stopped around about 2:20 a.m., dead. And I suppose the thinking being that they're definitely no longer on the clock. Really, really accurate, really, really lacking in empathy, though, I think you'll agree. The band members, so the band is one of the great legends of the Titanic. They weren't crew members themselves. They were freelancers, and they were recruited to play on board the Titanic. And they famously played while the ship went down to try and keep the passengers calm. But they weren't officially White Star Line employees. And what happened in the last sort of 2 weeks after the Titanic went down was that the band members' families received invoices from the White Star Line for the uniforms that they wore while they were in service on the Titanic. And then just within a couple of weeks of the sinking, crew members on board the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, walked off in a mutiny. They decided they weren't sailing on this ship anymore, and they held the leaders of the White Star Line kind of to ransom on the basis that the White Star Line leaders had decided they weren't going to increase the number of lifeboats on board the Olympic, despite what had happened on board the Titanic. Now, it needs to be said that they did ultimately do so, but that wasn't their first instinct. And I think partly what it boils down to is they had a really strong culture. Their culture was one in which they were right about everything. They didn't take a lot of outside advice. They weren't flexible with the rules. They decided this is how it was going to be, and people were expected to be rigid. And it's part of the reason, I think, that the accident happened in the first place. But it's certainly evident in terms of the actions that they took afterwards. Is a strong culture a good thing? I'm really not so sure. I think when we speak about culture, when we think about the kinds of things we want, perhaps we should be focusing more on flexibility, on advancement, on change, on being open to grow and to mature and to embrace new ideas. If we have a culture that enables us to do those sorts of things, we can probably have a really great organization. Otherwise, we're likely to run ourselves into trouble. That's my thought for the week. Have a great week.